So next, we'll need to find repeating patterns in our code and extract them into placeholder selectors. That way we can reuse bits of code without creating extra output. Now, what's great about placeholder selectors is that they do not compile to CSS unless they're extended or called up in another rule. And when they do output to CSS, the result is one grouped selector rule containing the shared styles. So because of that, placeholders, or extends as they're sometimes called, are a smart solution for sharing styles between related rule sets, particularly base styles. So when working with placeholder selectors, I'll usually create an extends partial inside each of the folders and create all the related placeholders there. So that keeps everything a little closer together, right? But in this case, we're only going to extend rules in our layout styles. So inside our layout directory, let's create a new file. So I'm going to select it, right-click the folder, and say New File. And we're going to name it _extends.scss. So first up, most of our layout containers, like the header, footer, and content areas, share the same text-aligned center style. Now, this might be a good time to create what I call a helper or utility placeholder rule we can use in our project. So let's go back to our new extends partial, and let's create our first placeholder. And it's good to add comments explaining what's in the file. So I'm going to add a comment that says center text. And let's create a new placeholder rule by typing a %, and let's call it centered. Then we'll open up a set of square brackets. So now let's go back to our containers partial, and let's cut out this text-aligned center declaration, and let's remove this grouped rule altogether. Then I'll save it, go back to extends.scss, and we'll paste the text-aligned declaration inside our centered placeholder rule. All right, so now we can extend this placeholder in some of our layout rules, and it will always inherit this style. So let's go back to our containers partial, and let's scroll down to our primary content rule. And as our first declaration, let's say @extend and the name of our placeholder, which is $centered, followed by a semicolon. All right, so let's copy the extend we just wrote, and let's save our containers partial. I'm going to close it out for now, and let's open up our header partial and include the extend here as well. So again, as the first declaration in our main header rule, let's go ahead and paste in the extend directive. So I'll save, close it out, and finally we also need to include it in our footer component. So let's open up the footer partial, and up top, paste in our extend. All right, so let's save it and close it out. So when using placeholders, we need to be careful which rules or declarations we extend, because extending a lot of these single declarations can also make things a little difficult to maintain, especially if we're just sort of plugging these into random rules. So sometimes it's okay to repeat a little to keep the code maintainable. Now, in this case, I'm using this as a utility rule, since as we just saw, a few of our layout components need to be center aligned. But we should also avoid building entire sections of our site using a bunch of single disparate extends. So back in our style.scss partial, let's scroll up, and here we see another repeating style we're using for creating top borders. So we created this style as a sort of reusable rule. So in our SAS project, it makes sense to turn this into a placeholder helper rule. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out the border top declaration, and I'm going to delete the T-border rule, and let's actually delete these stray comments here. And we'll go back to our extends partial, and right below the one we just wrote, let's create another comment that says top border, and let's create a placeholder called T-border for top border. And inside the placeholder rule, I will paste in that border top declaration. All right, now just like with our centered placeholder, we can extend T-border wherever necessary. So for instance, I'm going to copy the placeholder name, and let's go inside our container partial. And in the primary content rule, since the primary content container has a top border, we're going to @extend the T border placeholder. And we're going to do the same in our secondary content rules. Let me go ahead and copy this declaration and paste it as the first declaration in our secondary content rule. All right, so next, when we scroll up, notice how our primary and secondary content containers also share these base styles. Now, it might be okay to keep these grouped in one rule, like we have here, but let's create a placeholder rule for these. And these can function as base styles for any layout container we may add later on. So I'm going to go ahead and select all the declarations inside this first rule, cut them out. Now we can go ahead and delete this top rule. And back in our extends partial, right below the T border placeholder, let's create one more. And we're going to call this containers. And let's call our placeholder content. So we're going to say percentage content, a set of curly braces, then inside, paste in those declarations. All right, so now we can extend this placeholder inside the primary and secondary content rules. So let me just go ahead and copy this for later. I will save our extends partial and go back to our containers partial. So first, inside the primary content rule, we're going to say @extend content, and we'll do the same thing right below in our secondary content rule. All right, so now we can kind of do the same thing for our columns. So if we open up the columns partial, we can actually cut down the lines of CSS by creating a placeholder for the shared column styles. All right, so let's first cut out the width declaration in our first rule and delete it. And back in our extends.scss partial, we'll create another one for columns. And we're going to call this one columns. So let's say %, columns, and let's paste in that width declaration. All right, so now we can go back to our columns partial and extend the placeholder. So we'll say @extend columns, and we'll do the same thing below in our resorts rule. All right, so we're all set with our columns, so we can close out our file. And finally, let's create one more helper rule for our float clearfix. So in our style.scss partial, I'm going to select and cut the float clearfix out of here. And let's go back to our extends file, and right below columns, let's add a comment for clearfix. And this time I'm going to do things a little differently. So I'm going to create a placeholder like we've been doing, and we're going to name it clearfix. But this time inside, I'm going to paste in that clearfix rule. And instead of using the group class in the pseudo element selector here, I'm going to replace group with an ampersand. And what this does is it references the parent selector in a rule. So now instead of going into our HTML and adding the class group every time we need to clear float, we can now extend the clearfix placeholder wherever necessary. So for example, if we open up our index.html file and scroll down, we can see that the secondary content container needs a clearfix because it has the class group. So now we can go back to our partial file. So let's open up the containers partial and extend that clearfix placeholder inside the secondary content rule. So right beneath the T border extend, let's say @extend clearfix. And now we can actually go back to our HTML file and make sure all unnecessary classes have been removed from the markup. So for instance, we can now get rid of the group class, and we can also get rid of this T border class since we extended it. And if we scroll up to the primary content div, we can see that it's also using this T border class. So now we can actually delete it since we're extending it inside the primary content rule. So before we move on, you may have noticed the error in the console, and this is telling us that Sass can't find those placeholders we just declared. Well, that's because we still haven't imported our extends placeholder inside our index partial. So in our index partial, let's go ahead and import that extend partial. So I'll just go ahead and copy one of these, and I will paste it in as the last import. That way we avoid specificity issues later on. And then we're going to define the new partial name. So let's type extends. And it looks like we're still getting an error in the console, and that's probably because we still need to save our extends file. And there we go. Everything looks good. So if we go back to our browser and refresh, all our styles are back to normal. And we get our nice, clean-looking website again in the browser. So as we just saw, placeholder selectors are one of the most useful features when refactoring with Sass. But if we're not careful about how we use them, we can accidentally extend unintended code and bloat our CSS output. So I've posted a related video on this in the teacher's notes, so make sure to check that out.